Okay, everyone, welcome to lesson 5. This lesson is intense, so I have to give you a heads up, but it's intense in a very powerful way. When you walk through this lesson, you'll get a break from the normal way of seeing reality to a whole new dimension. So in previous lessons, we spoke about God and our relationship with God and God's expectation from us. In this lesson, we're going to ask all those got you, Rabbi questions that people ask. For example, can God create a rock that he cannot lift? Number 2, does God's knowledge of the future prevent our free choice? Question number 3, is there anything that is too difficult for God? And number 4, does God have regrets? Can we change his mind? These are the 4 questions that each one can get a lesson of its own. But we decided that the group here is so solid that we can do all 4 topics in one night. You guys ready?
Ready.
Okay, so let's go to our first question. Can God create a rock that he can't lift? In general, this question is asked in so many different ways. Can God create an elephant and stick it through the eye of a needle while the elephant remains its size of an elephant and the eye of the needle is still the eye of the needle, right? Or so many varieties. Can God create another God that's as strong as himself? All these different varieties to these questions about, and the premise of the question is, God is so powerful, he can do anything. Can he really do anything? Or are there limits to where we say, oh, well, he could do everything with an asterisk, like except, all these different scenarios that he can't do. So what's your thoughts on this? Are there go for it, Stan? What do you think?
It's kind of like an oxymoron. It's just a ridiculous question. It's kind of like another example of that is if you're driving your car at the speed of light and you turn your headlights on, what happens? I mean, it's just a ridiculous question.
Okay, so it's a ridiculous question. So we can go on to question number 2. So question number 2 is, no, I'm joking. Well, it's a good point. It's a good point you're making. And this is how we're going to view it today. I'm going to introduce you to 2 approaches that people take. There's the rationalist approach and there's the Kabbalistic approach. The rational approach says as follows. He distinguishes, there's creation-related problems, that means physics issues, and then there's God-related issues. So we have questions, can God fit an elephant through the eye of a needle? Or God-related, can he limit himself and still be infinite? These are both the same kind of question, paradox. But the rational response is, there are times that God can break all physics. If you ask a question about physics, God can break physics. And there's numerous stories in the Torah of God breaking physics. God made the splitting of the sea. That's breaking physics. But not what is logically impossible. God can't do something that is logically impossible. Let's look to the words of Maimonides in Guide for the Perplexed. Genya, if you could take us for text 1 on page 142.
Defining perfection. The inability to accomplish something that is beyond one's share does not constitute imperfection. We should not allow someone weak if they are not able to lift 1,000 talents. So too, we do not consider God to be imperfect because he can transform himself into a body.
Exactly what Stan was saying. It has to be a reasonable question. You cannot ask, is he so strong that he can make himself weak? Well, that's a contradiction. It makes no sense. So the question makes no sense. But can God do miracles? Sure. And that's the rationalist approach. There once was three boys. They were arguing in the school playground. And one said, my father's so fast, he can throw an arrow and he can get to the target before the arrow does. The other boy says, that's nothing. My father's a hunter. He could shoot his rifle and get to the animal before the bullet does. The third one says, that's nothing. My mother works in the DMV. She finishes work at 4:30 and she's home by 3:45. So sometimes like that's a paradox. It's a contradiction. It's ridiculous. Obviously, she didn't leave at 4:30 and get home at 3:45. Something else is at play here. So same thing when you ask these kind of questions about God, the rationalist says, it's not a question. It's not a question. It doesn't, when you're playing with the rules of logic, it's not a question. You have to ask a fear question. Okay. Come the mystics, and the mystics say, yeah, your question has to be, your answer has to fit into logic. But who created logic? God created logic. So God exists beyond logic. When you compress God and say he has to fit into logic, that is actually wrong. That's a mistake. You're putting limits onto God as if God has to fit within logic. No, God is the creator of logic, and sometimes he fits within logic, but often he exists beyond logic. Just like God exists above time and exists beyond space, he exists beyond logic, and therefore it's a fair question to ask. And the answer? Who knows? We would only know if God told us. But the Kabbalists say, you know what? Rationalists, it's fear if you're limited by reason. In other words, it's a fear. If you're playing by the rules of reason and logic, we agree with you. But God is not limited to logic. And then the rationalists will say to the Kabbalists, but how do you know? How do you know? If we could only use reason to figure things out, then we have to play by the rules of logic. How do you know? You ever interviewed God? They'll ask the Kabbalists. Have you ever interviewed God to know exactly what God is about? All we have is our mind. So it's the only tool available to us. What do the Kabbalists answer? What's the Kabbalist response? Yeah, we did interview God. We interviewed God at Mount Sinai. He revealed himself to us, and he told himself to us through a tradition, through received information. So what the Kabbalists are saying, what we know about God, it's not something you can reach through knowledge, through discovery, because discovery will get you to a certain point, but it won't get you all the way there. What does Kabbalah mean? Does anyone know what Kabbalah means? The words Kabbalah? Kabbalah means receive, received. This is received wisdom that we received as a chain from Mount Sinai. That's how we know this information. And we know that God can do things that defy logic. He can do the impossible. Now, with our brain, we'll never be able to wrap our heads around it because we're finite creatures. Maimonides himself, do you think Maimonides was a rationalist or a Kabbalist? What do you think?
Rationalist.
What did he say, Joe?
Rationalist.
In the text that we just read earlier, he was describing the rationalist argument. And that was in a book of philosophy called The Guide to the Perplexed. And in that book, he only offers rational approaches, things that you can comprehend with your mind. However, in his book of Jewish law, where the whole book of Jewish law is based on the tradition of Mount Sinai, over there, he behaves more like a Kabbalist. Because when he's playing by the rules of logic, you have to stick to the rules of logic. And he only makes logical arguments in his Guide to the Perplexed. However, when in his book of Jewish law, when he's clearly discussing things that the Jews interviewed God, and God said, this is what I like, this is how I like my mitzvahs done. Okay, so over there, he actually goes beyond reason and says, actually, it's not reason. So although Maimonides doesn't address this question about paradoxes in the book of Jewish law, but we see in other places that he goes to this idea that not everything has to fit logic to be reasonable. For us, it's unreasonable, but for God in the created universe, everything has to be logical. The way God interacts with our universe also should be pretty logical. But God lives beyond the universe too. There's the world before it came to existence, and so there's logic before logic existed. Okay, so let's take a look at the Rashba, Reb Shlomo ben Aderet. He was a Spanish sage, and let's get a volunteer to read the Kabbalistic side of the argument. So, Joel, read for us text 2.
Okay, something came to mind. Just bear with me. It's Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan. Can God be in place where there's he said something interesting, said the concept of 1 + 1 = 2, it's all over, even though physically it can't be where there's something else. So there's a different plane of existence, but never mind.
That's true. Not true.
Okay. It is clear that the beliefs that we have that are rooted in our tradition are those that are sourced in prophetic revelation, cannot be falsified by logic. The truth is that no one would deny a truth that is accepted on faith unless he or she was one of those who deny the possibility of anything that is naturally or physically impossible. Those who say that the impossible is impossible, even for God, it is as if they assert that nothing transcends their own logic. But the truth is that the transcendent God oversees natural law. He can and does change it on occasion, for he is its master to preserve it or change it.
Okay. So to a rationalist, can you make an argument that 2 + 2 is 5? No, there's no way to make that square up. But to a Kabbalist, they'll say, well, God could have created a reality where 2 + 2 = 5. That's not the reality he created, but that is a reality. So when you ask the question, could God do something? Sure. The fact that God created the world in this way doesn't mean God had to create it in this way. He could have created it in a totally different manner. And okay, so the mystical response, assuming that everything God does is rational, places a great limitation on God. In fact, one of the most difficult things I have when I'm speaking to certain people is, it's very few, but certain people, they think that they know everything, or that they know everything that they don't know. I know exactly what I don't know. And that's wrong. We don't know what we don't know. And so to have that confidence that, oh, this person is behaving like this, especially cynical people, this person is behaving like this, he's just trying to get attention. That's why he's trying to do it. And then you try to say, well, maybe there's other possibilities. And they're too stuck and they're like, no, and I know everything there is to know, and this must be the reason. So people to have that confidence, it's not reasonable. And so that's the same thing is the Kabbalistic approach. And Hasidus kind of takes this, tries to mirror these two approaches of the rationalist and the Kabbalist, and they say it's true. When God is expressing himself in the image of God, then he behaves in a more rational, logical way, because that's the interface he chose to relate with us so we can have a relationship with him. Because he's infinite, we're finite. How are we going to have a relationship when it's absurd, the finite and infinite having a relationship? So it creates a paradigm and a framework with logic. And so God acts within that framework. But sometimes we go beyond logic. What are 2 examples of that? So there are 2 examples that we can give of where we see in our physical universe where God creates the impossible, where the two paradoxes exist in the same space. So the first example is the ark. In the most holy place to the Jewish people is the Holy Land of Israel, within it Jerusalem, within it the Bet HaMikdash, within it the Holy of Holies. Holy of Holies, no man was allowed to walk into the Holy of Holies except for the high priest on Yom Kippur. In it, in the room, there was one piece of furniture, the Ark of the Covenant. In the Ark of the Covenant was the tablets, the broken set of tablets, and the second set of tablets, a jar of the manna, and some other things were contained in the Ark of the Covenant. But we notice something interesting when it describes the dimensions of the room of the Holy of Holies. And look at the math here. It says the Holy of Holies was 20 cubits. A cubit is about 1.5 to 2 feet, okay? It's the size of an arm. So 20 cubits wide. Then the Torah goes on to say that from one side of the ark to the other side of the ark is 10 cubits. So if you took a measuring stick, a measuring tape, and the high priest would walk from the wall to the ark, he would get 10 cubits. He would walk to the other side of the ark, measure out 10 cubits. The ark itself was 2.5 cubits. But somehow when he measured the entire Holy of Holies wall to wall, it was 20 cubits. Somehow the ark, as the expression goes, let's see, they don't bring the text here, but it says, Makoim ha'arin eina mina mida. The space of the ark did not take up space. So this was something that the high priest was able to see with his physical eyes. He walked into the Holy of Holies, and he would say, I see it. I see the ark is a measurable thing. You can measure it. It's 2.5 cubits. Yet, it's not taking up any space in the Holy of Holies. So you say, explain it to me. He says, I can't explain it to you. But you saw it? Yeah, I saw it. So explain it to me. I can't. I saw it, but I cannot explain it. It's just not explainable because it doesn't fit into logic. That was one example where God chose to express on beyond paradox. I could live, paradox doesn't scare me. I could exist within paradox. So he expressed that by the space of the ark. There's another thing that God creates something that's stronger than him, or something that he cannot control. Do you know what that is? It's you. It's you, mankind. God creates man and says, I control everything except your decisions. I decide what era you're going to be born in, how rich you'll be, all these things I decide. But your choices, that's out of my hand. Your choices and how you're going to respond to the things I put before you, that's not in my control. So I could put the snake to Adam and Eve, right? That's my control. How Adam and Eve will respond, that's in their control. So that's an example of something that God creates, but he cannot control, right? That's the next question. That's the next question. Very good. Okay, but that's the idea. So that's just two powerful examples how the Kabbalists and Hasidus sees this. They say, rationalists, you're doing a good job. You're being rational and you're being reasonable. And when you're writing a book of philosophy, you should stick to your arguments. Don't change. But Jews don't just live on philosophy. We also live on tradition and revelation. And therefore, we also know. And that's also this comment of this idea of revelation and tradition explains a lot of things that rabbis make assertions. And you say, like, how do you know that? Well, you're not going to know it from logic because certain things are not provable. For example, God's existence, it's reasonable, it's logical, but it's not provable. That comes from revelation. Okay, let's go to our next question. Okay, let's sum up this question before we move on. Can God create a rock that he can't lift? Nothing is impossible for God. Yet, he chooses to confine himself to the constraints of logic as often as possible. Okay, so that's how we answer this question. So continue asking logical questions. It's not like we said, oh, logic has no basis to use. No, use it. Recognize it's a tool that helps us discover a lot about God, but it has its limits. Okay, let's go on to question number 2. And this is exactly the lead up. Does God's foreknowledge preclude our free choice? We just ended off that everyone has free choice. Well, God knows what we're going to do before we even did it. So do we really have a choice? Are our choices really free? I told you this class was going to be a deep one. Okay, so let's go to a simple, actually, before we go into this question, did I skip? I think I skipped something. Yeah, I skipped. Okay, this is related to our free choice, our ability to go beyond ourselves. This is a powerful idea. Something when people met the Rebbe, so many people were amazed by his wisdom and his insight. But what made people become his followers and become fired up and inspired was when you were next to the Rebbe, you felt nothing was impossible. You felt nothing was impossible because the Rebbe said, we each have within us a piece of God that gives us this power to make choices. And sometimes we imprison ourselves to think, okay, these are the choices we have before us, and I can't do this, I can't do that. And the Rebbe inspired people, no, you have a godlike power to make choices and to even make choices that you think are full out of your box and think, oh, those are not doable or those are not reasonable.
(1956), Rosh Hashanah, the Tashlich ceremony, where we cast away the burdensome sins of the past year, is performed beside a body of water. For years, the Lubavitcher Rebbe would embark on a 1-mile walk to the lake in the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens, an entourage of dancing Hasidim at his side. But this year, there is an autumn downpour. The Brooklyn streets are empty. Undeterred, the Rebbe walks into the storm. The march goes on. The Hasidim arrive at the park, only to find the gates closed and locked. After all, who would visit the gardens in the midst of the rainstorm? Swiftly, the Rebbe begins to scale the 8-foot metal barricade. He reaches the top, leans over, and descends on the other side. And then he beckons to the drenched Hasidim, as if to say, join me. All the Hasidim, young and old, strong and frail, climb over the wall. The prayer is recited, and the Rebbe begins to sing. The assembled break into joyous dance. The Hasidim return in the rain. Their fedoras drip with dissolved ink, staining their holiday clothes. Back in the warm confines of 770, the Rebbe pours wine for all those who had scaled the barricade. There is joy and exhilaration, because the Rebbe has revealed something in those who had joined the daring expedition. No wall can stand between a Jew and their desire to become close to God. No barricade is unscalable. You will never know the things you are capable of, the limitless nature of your soul, until you begin to climb. Because in every mortal body beats an immortal piece of God. You are as limitless as the God who resides within you.
So that's a powerful idea. And with that, we go into our next question. Does God's foreknowledge preclude our free choice? God knew, did God know that the Rebbe was going to go out in the rain? Did God know that he was going to climb the fence? Is there anything that God doesn't know? Of course God knew. So if God knew it, so in what sense? It's not like God knows 20 different future realities and then is waiting for you to make your choice. God knows with certainty, because God knows everything. God lives beyond time. So certainly God knows everything that happened and will happen. And so how do we have free choice within that? That's the question we're going to tackle now. This concept of free choice is so fundamental to the whole of Judaism. We believe that if you make the right choices, you are granted Gan Eden, a portion of the world to come. You make bad choices, it's bad. Well, that's only if I have choices to make. What if everything is being controlled by God and God knows everything that we will do? Then all these things have no value. So it's a fundamental belief of Judaism, and it's stated in text 4. Moses is telling the Jews what God says. See, I set before you today life and good and death and evil. I call today upon the heaven and the earth to serve as witness that I have informed you. I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. Choose life. So we have this special ability and gift that we can make choices. And the question is, how do we square that with God's knowledge? Do you want the simple answer or the answer that I feel is more correct? Okay, so we'll go with the simple answer as presented in the teacher's manual, but I'm going to go a little more advanced. Okay, the simple answer is as follows. For this, we have a game. We're going to ask Joel and Stan to unmute. It really goes with a couple, so the questions might be a little odd, but we're going to see how well you know each other. So Joel, I'm going to ask you questions about Stan. You're going to tell me what you think his response would be. Okay, so Joel, question for question for you. Stan is going out for lunch and the waiter is obnoxious and rude. Is Stan gonna leave a tip anyways? And if yes, how much?
Yes.
So what do you think?
Yes.
He's gonna leave a tip?
He will leave a 50% tip.
No, seriously, do you think he'll leave a tip or do you think just the average amount, more or less?
The waiter was rude.
Yeah.
I would say he would leave a tip, but maybe just the minimum.
Stan, do you agree with that?
Well, I usually leave 15 to 20%. If the service is good, 20%. If the service is not good, 15.
Very good.
Good
Wow.
ratio.
Wow. Joe, so tomorrow if Stan goes to a restaurant and he leaves the tip you presented, did your knowledge of what Stan's going to do intervene in his ability to make a free choice about how to tip?
He still
No.
has free choice.
So Stan, let's ask you a question about Joe. Okay. Joe's wife sends him with a shopping list to the store. So what will he come home with? A, everything on the list. B, everything on the list plus a few extra. C, he'll miss out a few things. D, he'll come home with a few items that he has no clue how it got into the shopping cart.
I would say, hey, you would come home with everything on the list.
Joe, do you agree?
Well, if I didn't come home with everything on the list, I wouldn't go home.
That's right. Very good. So what we're showing here is that knowledge.
Rochelle wants. Rochelle says she wants equal time here.
So what we're demonstrating is that sometimes just because you know something doesn't mean you're causing it. For example, there was once a community that was having a drought for a long time. And they decided it's a Jewish community, and when there's no rain for a long time, you gather in the synagogues and you pray and you bring out the Torah scrolls and you fast. And the simple Jew walks in and he says, I don't understand. Why is everyone, what do you mean? We're an agriculture community. We rely on our farms. We don't have rain. We're desperate. So we're praying to God. He says, what do you mean? Why don't you just bring the rain? He says, how do I bring the rain? How do we bring the rain? It's very simple. You just take the cat and you put it next to the stove. They're like, what are you talking about? It's like, yeah, every time that it's about to rain, the cat runs into the house and goes next to the stove, right? So in his simple mind, he thinks that bringing the cat next to the stove will cause it to rain. But as they say, correlation does not equal causation. Just because cats go next to the stove doesn't cause the rain. Same thing, knowledge of an event doesn't create the event. The same way your knowledge of the past doesn't change the past. Your knowledge, God's knowledge of the future is like your knowledge of the past. God knows the future. He knows everything. It's not a contradiction. If you had a time machine, this answer is presented by a rabbi who lived in North. This is presented by many rabbis, but the text that we're going to use is presented by a rabbi that lived in the 1500s in North Africa, and he was actually very instrumental in representing the Jews in a petition before the Suleiman to gain equal rights for the Jews. So, or I don't know, equal rights, but certain civil rights. So let's read text 147. Gail, if you could read for us 147, text 5.
Conservation does not imply conservation. Here's an analogy that will clarify the matter. Suppose I see Reuben running. Well, while he is certainly running, his running isn't compelled by my knowledge and observation of his running. Although my knowledge is absolute, his running is by choice. Same applies to divine knowledge. God's foreknowledge of our choices doesn't compel our choices because God transcends time and our future is his present. Just as our knowledge of current events doesn't compel those events, so does his knowledge of our future choices not compel our choice.
Okay, let's take this a little deeper. Okay, so that was the simple answer. The simple answer is knowledge, observing something does not cause something. So just because God observes our choices doesn't mean, and he knows our choices, doesn't mean he causes our choices. The only problem is that there's a difference between human knowledge and God's knowledge. Remember how we said that God is the space of everything and the world is within the space of God? So there's no knowledge outside of God. When I see a piece of furniture in front of me, the table is, if I see the table is not in me. I know the table. So I'm becoming aware of things outside of me. Right? So constantly throughout the day, I'm picking up more knowledge. And so things are changing within my brain. I'm processing new information about the world. Oh, there's tables, there's chairs, there's people. But for God, he knows everything. He's self-knowledge. And so when we make choices, we're actually changing the unchangeable God. What do we do when we have free choice? So how does God's knowledge creates, God's knowledge of events is what creates the event. The fact that it exists is because God knows it. That's how it comes into existence. So from that approach, it's actually, this answer is not sufficient. And that's why Maimonides, I have to find it in the student book because it's in the appendix. It's on page 163 in the student book. Maimonides, in his book of law, remember we said in his book of law, he behaves more like a Kabbalist than a rationalist. So into his book of law, he writes, text 15. Everyone have the page 163? Mm-hmm. One might ask, since God knows all that will occur before it comes to pass, did he or did he not know whether a person will be righteous or wicked? If he knew that the individual will be righteous, it will be impossible for them not to be righteous. However, if we say that despite God's knowledge, it is possible for the person to be wicked, then his knowledge is incomplete. So he asked the question that we start in this section. Then Maimonides says, know that the answer to this question, and he uses an expression from Job, is longer than the earth in measure and broader than the sea. And human intelligence can't comprehend it in its entirety. Just as it is beyond our potential to comprehend and conceive God's essential truth, as the Torah states, no human being will perceive me and live. so too it is beyond our ability to comprehend and conceive the Creator's knowledge. Now the commentaries right away jump on Maimonides. Maimonides, why are you bringing a question and not answering it? Better skip the question. But he's trying to create doubts in people. Don't bring a question that you don't have an answer to. And also there's a simple answer, and they give the answer that we just presented, the rationalist answer of observation does not equal causation, just because God observes. But why was Maimonides not happy with that answer? Because he said God's knowledge is one with the universe and one with every event that's happening with the universe. So God's knowledge is what creates. So how do we act within that? And what's Maimonides' answer? He says, yeah, within the framework of logic, within our created universe, God's observation doesn't cause causation. But beyond our universe, God is beyond it. His knowledge does create our universe, does create everything that happens. God's knowledge is one with the universe, when you go from a higher vantage point. And therefore, he says, I don't want to answer this question here. I just want you to remember these two facts are facts. They're paradoxical, and God can be paradoxical. These two things are facts. God knows everything in self-knowledge, and you have free choice. And Maimonides wasn't being original here. He's just repeating a statement that Rabbi Akiva made in Pirkei Avot. Rabbi Akiva says, Hakol Safoy, everything is known, and freedom of choice is granted. He says it as a statement, not as a question. He says, just remember these two pillars. If you think you have a good answer to this paradox, you're either misunderstanding the power of our choice, you're minimizing how much freedom we have in our choice, or you're minimizing God's knowledge of the events that are happening. And I don't want you to do that. I want you to contain both of these concepts in your mind at all times. That God's knowledge is one with the universe, self-knowledge. And two, you have absolute free choice in your decisions, not necessarily in outcomes. We're not in the game of outcomes, but in your choices, you have absolutely free choice. So that's just a more advanced version of this. And ultimately, we say, does God's foreknowledge? So just to go to the concluding slide. Does God's foreknowledge preclude our free choice? God's foreknowledge isn't the cause of our choice. It is the outcome of our choice. This is the basic answer. But the more deep answer is that actually you're minimizing God's knowledge. God's knowledge is actually one with events, unlike our knowledge, that our knowledge is separate from the events that are happening. And therefore, really, to live with the paradox is more truthful and more Jewish than to kind of minimize it with this answer and say, oh, human knowledge, our knowledge of events don't cause the events, but God's knowledge of events seem to have a one-on-one relationship with each other. So how does that lead to free knowledge? Okay, everyone can handle that, live with that? Okay. Let's go on to our next question. Is there anything that God finds difficult to do? Is there anything that's too difficult for God? So the short answer is no. There is nothing difficult for God. Just say, hold on. God created the world in 6 days, and then what did he need to do? He needed to rest. So clearly things are difficult. What do you need to rest? But the truth is that we never understood that. Jewish tradition doesn't understand it that way. Let me just find my page, because we did some page spinning. Let's go to page 149. Okay, in the beginning, how did God create the world? Did he use hammers? Did he use tools? What was the mechanism he used to create the world? He used his words. Very good. Text 6, by the word of God, the heavens were made. Rabbi Yehuda Bar Simon said, God created his world without toil or exertion. Rather, there was the word of God, and already the heavens were made. The premise is, creating the world is effortless. It was not difficult for God. Just like to say one word doesn't cause you, I need to take a break, I need a rest. Speaking one word doesn't cause exhaustion. The creation of the world doesn't cause exhaustion. Why did God rest? It's a whole different concept. It's not concept of taking a break. It's a concept of, instead of going outwards, going inwards. So 6 days a week, you go outwards. On the seventh day, you go inwards. Okay. The thing is, we don't finish the section here because we look in many different places in the Torah, in rabbinic literature, not necessarily in the Torah, but in rabbinic literature, where it says there are things that are difficult for God. See, here we see that the creation account stresses that God spoke the universe into being. While the talking, God created his exertion. There's nothing hard for God. Okay, so what are the exceptions? Let's look at a teaching from Rabbi Bar Chana, who said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan in text 7a. This is look at what he writes. Rabbi Bar Chana says that Rabbi Yochanan says, it is as difficult for God to match a couple together as was the splitting of the Red Sea. Making a match is difficult. It's difficult. Okay, statement number one. So hold on, we have two examples here that are difficult. What's the two things that are difficult? Splitting of the sea and making matches. Did you know that creating the world was easy? Splitting the sea, that was difficult. Making a match, that's difficult. Let's look at another text. Text 7b. Providing a person's livelihood is as difficult for God as the splitting of the Red Sea. For it says he provides food to all flesh, and King David nearby writes, to him who divided the Red Sea into parts. Okay, just as splitting the sea is difficult, so is financial support. So splitting the sea is difficult, matchmaking is difficult, providing assistance is difficult. So how are we going to square this? How could it be difficult for God? And also, what is the commonality between these three things? Between splitting the sea and matchmaking and providing sustenance? Is it difficult for God to feed you? Is it difficult for God to make a shidduch? You know, there was once a mistress, a princess that asked Rabbi Akiva, you know, God created the world. What's he been busy since then? What's he been doing since then? Rabbi Akiva said, he's making matches. That's what he's busy with. He says, oh, that's easy. I can do that. He says, go ahead. So she took the 300 butlers. Someone could look me up if it's 3,000 or 300, but something in that range. Took all the butlers and all the maids. That night, she made a whole bunch of matches between the maids and the butlers. And then the next morning, one came with a broken arm and one with a leg, and it didn't work out so well. She's like, okay, you're right. It's not that simple. It's a difficult job. Okay, so what's the commonality between these two? The answer is
vaccine Monday night and minimal side effects.
So the explanation is what is something that's difficult for us? What do we consider difficult? We're not saying impossible. What's difficult for us? Whenever we have to do something that's not normal for us. Things that are not normal, we consider difficult, right? If it's normal for us, it's easy. So to lift a book off the shelf, is that hard? No. But to lift a bookcase, that's hard, right? The same thing is whenever God does something that's not normal, we call that hard. Now, is it really hard for God? No. But when the rabbis are trying to explain to us that this was God going beyond normal, he's doing something that's not normal, they use the language hard. How do we see it in these three scenarios? God interacts with our world in two modes. Midas Hadin, he is particular. Misdeeds require consequences. That means it's a path of justice and fairness. So if you behave good, you get good. If you behave bad, bad things happen to you, right? That's the midas hadin. Everything is fear and measured. You don't get what you don't deserve. When God creates the world, he creates it with measurement. His flow, his original flow is kindness, because he has to be generous first to decide, I want to create a world. But once he decides to create a world, he creates it in perfect measure. Everything fits, everything belongs. But then he also has another mode called midas harachamim. He is merciful and forgiving of misdeeds, right? So these are competing modalities. God can either express himself in the first way or the second way. But can he do both at the same time? Well, whenever God does both at the same time, we call that kasha. We call that difficult. We call that hard. So when the rabbis use the word hard, it's an expression of bringing these two modalities together. Let's look at the case of the splitting of the sea, as the Zohar says. So let's get Maddie, you'll read for us text 8 and read it loud, so the Zoom readers could hear us.
When God wishes, the archangel's plea, when God wishes to do something, all before him is as naught, and nothing can stand in his way. Yet you say that the splitting of the sea was difficult. When God desired to split the sea for the Jewish people, Raham, the archangel of Egypt, protested before God, Master of the universe, why do you exact justice upon the Egyptians, but split the sea for the Jews? They are all guilty before you. They both serve idols. They have both committed sexual wrongs. They have both committed murder. Aren't your ways just and true? At that moment, it was difficult for God to override his sense of justice.
So at the basic level, God was using kindness in the first 10 plagues, right? When Moses comes to Pharaoh, let the Jewish people go. Pharaoh says, maybe not. If God was using his midas hadin, his judgment, Pharaoh's whole army would collapse, the Jews would walk free. But God says, actually, I want to teach the Egyptians to become mature, to become aware that there are things that are beyond them, that they are responsible towards, and they have to be compassionate. And so the 10 plagues, according to the Zohar, are seen as 10 lessons, different things that God was trying to demonstrate to them, different sense of awareness. For example, the river, the Nile turning into blood. At that time, their whole economy was based on the Nile. So they made the Nile into a god. So God was trying to teach them, no, there's something that is the source of the Nile, and that is God. And if God wants, he could turn the Nile from a source of plenty into a source of suffering. Right? And each plague was a demonstration. Had they woken up, everything would be good. But after 10 lessons, they weren't learning, they weren't picking up. So God says, okay, I'm switching here to midas hadin. No more am I going to be compassionate. Now, you let the people go, or I'll drown you in the sea. At that time, the archangel of the Egyptians says, God, fear is square. You gave us 10 chances, 10 strikes, we're out. But you have to imply that same to the Jewish people too. The Jews aren't all on their best behavior. You know, not all of them are like Moses. Many of them are misbehaving, except for keeping their culture. But in many ways, they're behaving just like the Egyptians were. They were worshiping idols. They were involved in other nonsense. So why should they get any miracles for them? At that time, God said, you make a fair point, but I'm going to express myself to them in midas harachamim, in my merciful way. So you're in merciful mode. So express it to the Egyptians. So for God to employ both of these towards the Egyptians to be in midas hadin mode, and towards the Jews in midas harachamim, that's considered difficult.
Does midas hadin have any connection to the Satan or the Sahara? Is there any connection to that?
Midas hadin means judgment.
Shender, go through with Satan.
No, it's considered, well, din is a good thing. Din is not a bad thing. Din isn't negative. In other words, imagine you were using your iPhone, but your iPhone was only responding to everything you did 10 seconds after you did it. So you touched the screen, and only 10 seconds later, it responded. What would you consider that? A broken iPhone. It's not responsive. It's not working. Well, when God is using Midas Hadin, everything is responsive. Whatever is done, the consequences of that actions is responded to right away. So you know, oh, this is good, because when this person does a good things happen. And this is a bad act, because when he does it, bad things start to happen. So you get a lot of clarity when you're living in a mode of Midas Hadin, and it becomes a more perfect world. But God says, well, there's a place for that, but there's also a place for being patient and being slow. So it's not like Midas Hadin is God being mean, and Midas Harachamim is God being kind. There's also a kindness in Midas Hadin. But it just depends who you are. If you're the one suffering it, it doesn't feel too good. But for humanity as a whole, it is very good. Evil is being eradicated. It's a good thing. Right? Okay. So now let's look how that compares to our other two examples. We have another example. God feeds everybody, right? Is there anyone that God doesn't feed? God is feeding everyone, and God is animating everyone all the time. And God is making sure they have food on their plate. What? Most people in the world have food. 98% of the people in the world have food. People don't realize it, but people somehow survive. And you say, well, this doesn't make so much sense. Why are so many people day in, day out, that they have food on a daily basis? Now, you might be puzzled. You say, like, what do you mean? What's the big deal that people have food? But we take it for granted because we have food every day. But for most of us, we're getting food from God, even though we don't necessarily deserve it. And God makes it appear in nature. God gives us our food in natural terms. So God is creating a miracle of sustaining all creatures in this world. And yet he does it in a very natural, in a cloak of nature, as if it's all natural. Oh, of course I worked hard at my job, so of course I brought home this check. Oh, of course I was put into Social Security, so of course I'm getting my social. Like everything is cloaked in nature. So that's also the same thing. God is using this double approach. He's doing a miracle within nature. The same thing is with relationships. When God pairs a couple, it's really idiotic for men and women to get together. They're not a good fit. They're opposites. They clash. There's so many jokes on this clash between the couples. And yet, God makes it work. So whenever God is doing two opposites at the same time, bringing together opposites, that's what we call difficult. Okay? So, for example, the Hanukkah story. In the Hanukkah story, we have two types of miracles. We have one miracle where the Jews battled the Greeks. Did anyone predict the Jews would win? No. But after the fact, if you wanted to be a skeptic, what could you say? Oh, look, the Jews are so smart. They used their brilliant tactics, and because they used their guerrilla warfare, that's why they won. And the Romans were coming, the Greeks they had to travel all the way from Syria, so it was a far trip. They weren't native. You could rationalize anything. So that's God hiding his miracles within nature. Then even the miracle of the oil, they have to put in some oil. The fact that it lasted 8 days, that's miraculous. But when you came and you saw oil burning, were you surprised that oil's burning? No, you're like, oil burns. You have to be in the know that there was actually a very small amount of oil, and it's actually very shocking that it's still burning 8 days later. But it looks natural. So when God expresses his miracles, awesome miracles, in natural means, we call that kasha, we call that difficult. Think the 6-Day War, the headlines were predicting before. But now when you watch all the documentaries about it, they say, oh, of course the Israelis won. They knocked out all the air bases before. Like, they make it as if, like, of course it was meant to happen. When God disguises his miracles in nature, it's called kasha. It's called difficult. But is it actually difficult? No. Nothing's difficult for God. It's just an expression of this idea. Okay. Also, here's another example they bring about the splitting of the sea. When God created the world, he hides himself. Why does he hide himself? Because if he's revealed, we would lose it. We would lose our sense of self. We can't have our sense of self when God's revelation is full on. So God has to hide his revelation, and that makes space for us to feel ourselves, and then for ourselves to choose God. If God would reveal himself, there would be no choice to choose God. We'd see, like, what do you mean? Do we choose God as a creator? We see God is here. What is there a choice? It's in our face. There's nothing to choose. But what happened at the splitting of the sea? God suspended that, but we still retained our sense of self at the same time. And that was for every single person. You didn't have to be a prophet. Even a little baby experienced that great revelation at the splitting of the sea. Now, because it was so beyond us, as soon as the splitting of the sea was gone, it didn't integrate with us because we couldn't tap into it. It was an experience that's like beyond us, that it actually had very little effect on our psyche because it was so beyond us, we couldn't internalize it. But for those few moments, they experienced something beyond. So that's considered difficult for God. Okay, so let's go. So is there anything that God finds difficult to do? Nothing is essentially difficult for God. However, an act of God that simultaneously features dueling divine energies is called difficult. And let's go on to our final question. If God has decided to do something, can we change his mind? What do you think? Yes. Yeah, I think we can all, well, when we make prayer, what are we doing when we're praying? It's like we're going cut screen, cut director, we have some edits we want you to make to the script, right? That's what we're doing when we're praying. So let's try. The thing is, it's a little strange, right? God is timeless. He knows all that will transpire. So how can he change his mind? In fact, Bilam was a prophet, a non-Jewish prophet, that the nation of Moab hired to curse the Jews, because God's bringing blessing to the Jews, and the Moabites and the Midianites are afraid of the Jewish people coming. So they hire Bilam to curse the Jews. Well, what's he going to curse? The idea is to get God to curse the Jews, right? That's the idea. What does Bilam tell them? Can I change God's mind? If God wants to bless them, no amount of money will change that. And ultimately, they say, yeah, but there has to be a price. Like, you're saying no amount, but even no amount, I'm sure there's a price. So Bilam tries convincing God, but obviously God doesn't change his mind. And yet, let's look. So let's look at the text from Bilam, text 11. Balaam spoke in a parable and said, "Arise, Balak, and hear. Listen to me closely, son of Zippor. God is not a man that he should lie, nor is he a mortal that he should have a change of heart. Would he say and not do, speak and not fulfill? If God makes a promise, he's going to keep his promise. God doesn't change his mind." Now, why do we change our mind? We usually change our mind when we pick up new information or new stimulus. So, for example, we made a decision. We had a certain set of political beliefs. Like Winston Churchill used to say that if you're young and you don't vote liberal, you have no heart. And if you're older and you don't vote conservative, you have no brain. Right? I used to say, like, you have to, right? People change as they grow, they become more pragmatic, more principled, more realistic. So you change. So we change our mind when we pick up new information, or we're responding to someone pulls at our heartstrings, so there's new stimulus. But to God, there's nothing new. Everything was, is, and will be. At the moment he created it, he also knows the end of the story. So how could he change the script? Now, where do we see that God changed the script? We see it in Genesis. God creates the world in the story of the flood. Text 12. God saw the great wickedness of the humans on the earth, and that their hearts, every inclination was consistently evil. God regretted that he had made humans upon the earth, and his heart was aggrieved. God said, I will erase the humans whom I created from upon the face of the earth, from man to beast, from creeping things to the fowl of the heavens, for I regret that I made them. So clearly we have the language here. I regret that I made them. So how do we square these two things? God, that Balaam is saying, God is not mortal, that he should have a change of heart. And in Genesis, it clearly says that he regrets that he created us. He created human civilization. Okay, let's go on. Anyone want to suggest an answer or their thoughts before we get in? If God knows everything, so how does God change the plan? In other words, he's designing. In other words, when we write a draft, we can edit it. So we're like, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't fit. But God knows what fits before he writes it. So when he writes the script for the history of the universe, it should flow exactly as God intended. Right? There shouldn't be room for changes. Go for it, Stan.
Well, if we look at the example of Noah, did God have to create a bubble to eliminate the people that he wanted to destroy? He could have just snapped his fingers and everyone would disappear. He created a bubble, and I think that's to give people a chance for teshuvah so they could survive.
So there was a purpose. In other words, there's some benefit, but let's try to get to the core of how this works. We'll go to the answer and then we'll try to flesh it out with some examples. The answer is that God has a vision, an ending point for the universe. The ending point for the universe is humans choosing God and bringing God into this world and making this world a home for him and developing a clear, close relationship with God without losing their identity of self. That's his design. He wants them to feel their self, not lose their self, but be fully attached and one with God and create a home for God, not in heaven, but in our broken, imperfect world. Right? That's God's goal. That's his plan. Now, God could have just snapped his fingers and he would have had a home for God on day one. No, but he wants us to do it. We have to be the ones who build the home. Not only do we have to build the home, we also have to kind of build the tools and the plan too. God wants us to do everything, or else it defeats the purpose. He could create a perfect world, and he has done that in spiritual realities called Atzilut, the different spiritual realms that exist that are perfect. But God wants a physical world with imperfect people on it. And those imperfect people are the ones that are going to make it a perfect world, a perfect unity with God without becoming angels. They'll still be people. They'll still be people that will behave in godly ways. That's his goal. For that to happen, there has to be stages of maturity. And so it happens slowly over time. Now, sometimes God presents a scenario. If we live up to the test, we grow and we go directly to the next stage. If not, sometimes we have to go through hardship, and that hardship matures us and helps us arrive at the next stage. So either we can be proactive and say, let us mature and let us grow. What if we abandon our mission and say, I'm not interested in growing. I'm comfortable in staying in this stage where I am in life. I don't want to grow. Well, then God says, don't worry. This world will force you to grow because there's a journey where it's going to. So the script is always consistent. From day one till the last day, humanity is going to grow. The question is, will they do the growth entirely on their own? Or will they need certain events to occur that will propel them towards that growth? And that's up to us. It's up to us in every generation. So every single consequence that happens in the world, it was meant to be. In other words, you say, if God wants the Jews to have the land of Israel, well, why didn't he create the Jews on day one instead of 2,000 years into existence? And why didn't he put them immediately in the land of Israel? Because there's a process here. There's a process of when things are supposed to unfold. 2,000 years into history, the Torah arrives at the scene. 5,000 years, computers arrive at the scene. Everything is at some stage in progression that's supposed to help us mature and evolve to this ability to bring God into our lives and bring God into our home. And it's different levels. So that explains an interesting thing. Maimonides says, if you have a prophet, now, like a prophet in the Torah, right? These biblical prophets. Someone says, I'm a prophet of God. How do you know if he's telling the truth? Anyone could say they're the prophet of God. How do you know if they're telling the truth? So there are certain no-nos. If he says, oh, God came to me and told me there's no more Torah, you know he's not a real prophet. He made it up. So there are certain rules of the prophet. But how do you really know if someone's telling the truth? If he makes a prediction of a good event that will happen, and it happens, then you know he's a prophet, because he knew the future, he predicted the future, the unlikely future, and it came to be. Maimonides says, what happens if the prophet predicts a negative event that will happen in the future, and it doesn't come to pass? Does that mean he's a false prophet? No. That doesn't mean he's a false prophet. Because when we're talking about a negative negative events are meant to teach us something, but we can learn it on our own by being focused and trying to grow. So we don't have to go through negative events if we're able to learn it ourselves. But if we're unable to learn, if we're not making attempts to learn it on our own, so then the world forces us to confront those and to grow into the mature state that we need. So that's why a prophet predicting a negative event in the future not coming to pass doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't tell us he was wrong or right. Maybe it was going to happen, but then we did teshuvah, we grew, so we didn't need that negative event to occur. However, when he promises a positive event, that has to happen. So let's go through the different texts that relate to this concept. Let's get Shelley, read for us text 13a. This is where Rashi is asking an interesting question. Why does the Torah start with the story of Genesis? Torah is a book of law. So it should start with the first set of instructions for the Jewish people. We learn Torah in order to gain instruction for life. How does reading the book of Genesis give us instruction for life? Reading about mitzvahs gives us instructions, what we have to do. But reading about God's creation, so read text 13a.
The Torah ought to have begun with the verse, this month shall be to you, which is the first mitzvah commanded to the people of Israel. Why does it begin with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and earth? The strength of his work he related to his people to give them the inheritance of the nations. If the nations of the world will say to Israel, you are thieves for having conquered the lands of the 7 nations, Israel will reply. The entire world is God's. He created it and granted it to whomever he desired. It was his will to give it to the 7 nations, and it was his will to take it from them and give it to us.
Okay, so Rashi is telling us, this is the first Rashi in the Torah. He's telling us, first of all, something interesting. He's saying something that feels very relevant and contemporary today, that Jews feel, what right do we really have to the land where maybe it doesn't belong to us? Yeah, it did belong to us, but we haven't been there for 2,000 years. Maybe it doesn't belong to us. No. God gave it to nations, but God created the world and he gave it to us. And so it's his dominion. So let's read the description of that. Kenya, if you could read for us text 13b.
Oh, really? You really want me to?
What?
No, I said, you really want me to? I'm like, with this, Rashi explains the concept of regret as it implies to God. It's not regret of the simple session. It means rather that God originated desire. What that first, actually, you know what? I don't want to read. I'm sorry. No, something happened. I had whatever. I had.
Okay, it's okay. Don't worry. Okay, so Joe, read for us text 13b.
Okay. With this, Rashi explains the concept of regret as it is applied to God. It is not regret in the simple sense. It means rather that God's original desire was that first he should give the land to the Canaanites, and then afterward to take it from them and give it to the Jews. The same is true regarding God's regret before the flood. Once again, it is not regret in the simple sense. It means, rather, that God's original desire was to first create the world and then to destroy civilization with the flood. This is called regret because, in actual fact, the second thought, though originally planned, leads to a different result from the first one, but it's not regret in the simple sense.
Okay, so the same way when the Torah says God has a hand, the hand of God, the arm of God, it doesn't mean God actually has an arm, but it responds to something. So whenever God's plan evolves to the next stage, we call it regret, so to speak. God said there's plan 1, there's phase 1, and then he goes to phase 2. From our experience, it feels like, hey, God changed how he wants this world to be. First, he said whoever wants the land of Israel could have it. And then he decided it goes to the Jewish people and the descendants of Abraham alone. He changed the rules. He changed the rules of the game. Well, he always had in mind that at a certain point, he's going to change the rules. So it's not like from God's point of view, there was ever a change in plan. This was always part of the sequence of events. From our frame of work, it could look like a change of plans. And if it's in the negative, it could look like regret. Okay, let's look. So God can have a change of heart. Okay, so then here's the other example from Maimonides. Let's read text 14. Stan, if you can read for us text 14.
Between positive and negative prophecies of retribution, for example, if a prophet will say, so-and-so will die, and this year there will be a famine or a war, and the like. If the prophecy does not come true, this does not prove that the prophet is a false prophet, nor do we say, look, he foretold and his words were not fulfilled. This is because God is slow to anger, abundant in kindness, and is prone to having a change of heart regarding meting punishment. It is possible that the intended recipients of the prophecy repented and they were forgiven, as was the case with the people of Nineveh, or that the retribution will be put on hold, as was the case of Hezekiah. If, however, a prophet foretold that good would come and such will occur, and the good that was prophesied did not materialize, that is surely a false prophet. For any good that God decrees, even if the decree is provisional, will never be retracted.
Okay, thank you. So whenever a prophet comes, he's always really giving us a call to action. And if we heed the call to action, good. If we don't heed the call to action, then there's another call to action in the form of crisis. And crisis helps us grow. So it's another call to action. So either you pay attention to the words of the prophet, or you hear it in a different way, a different message. But it's always for our growth. Okay, so to summarize the answer to our fourth question, if God has decided to do something, can we change his mind? So God doesn't change his mind. Sometimes, however, he determines from the outset that he'll change course at a certain point in the evolution of people. And there's always a possibility to change his mind from acting with justice. As God says, things have to be fair and square. Eventually, there's consequences or growth that needs to happen. And then if we grow into that, so then we kind of change how we were going to grow. Instead of growing from the consequences of our action, we grew from internal growth of pushing ourselves to grow. And that can happen too.
Lesson 5. His paradoxes. 1. According to the Jewish mystics, God, who created logic, is the architect of its constraints, not its prisoner. He can not only do the impossible, but also the unthinkable. 2. God is timeless, and to him, the future is present. His foreknowledge isn't the cause of our choice. It is the outcome of his observation of our choice. 3. The concept of something being difficult or challenging cannot apply to God. Nevertheless, when God simultaneously employs dueling divine forces, that is out of the ordinary and termed difficult. 4. A timeless God who knows all that will transpire in the future can't have a change of heart. Sometimes, however, God determines from the outset that first he will take one course of action, and later he'll change course. 5. When God determines to act with kindness, no mechanism can change that. From the outset, that is the only possible outcome. However, when God has a thought to act with justice, included in the original thought is always the possibility of changing God's mind and bringing about a kinder result.
Okay, for the grand finale is next week, our relationship. I do want to take this moment to encourage you to read the extras in the book. There's this whole extra section, especially last week at the end of lesson 4, these beautiful concepts that you can meditate on that develop feelings in your heart. That's the end of lesson 4. I only read it after the lesson. I'm like, I wish I read this before, and I remind you guys because it's so meaningful and powerful. So definitely take advantage in these books. There's different charts and different diagrams at the end of the lesson, at the end of every lesson. This week, lesson 5 is a short one, but also very insightful and interesting, especially if you're Kabbalistically inclined. And I hope to see you all for next week. I hope your brains are still whole and you didn't lose it. But definitely we had to do it. We had to address these questions. We couldn't skip these questions because this is what people ask. But we just put it into one class. That way we don't have to. Next week we'll be back to the light, relaxing discussions.
Thank you.
Okay.
And thank you for putting up with I have a terrible headache, so thank you.
Pleasure. Feel better. Refuah Shalema.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Better.
Thank you.
All right, good night,
Thank
everyone.
you, Rabbi. Have a good
Thank
night.
you, thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good night.